There is a version of the Rockefeller story that everyone knows. The poor boy from upstate New York who built Standard Oil, the man who controlled 90% of American oil and became the richest human being in history, the philanthropist who gave away $500 million and funded universities and eradicated diseases and built institutions that still carry his name. That version is true, every word of it, but it is not the complete story, because behind the ledgers and the donations and the carefully managed public image, there was another Rockefeller, one who crushed competitors, not just through superior efficiency, but through bribery, espionage, and tactics that his own lawyers described in private as criminal. One whose family funded eugenics programs that would later inspire the architects of the Holocaust. One whose grandson died under circumstances so strange that the official explanation has never fully satisfied anyone who looked at it closely. The Rockefellers did not just build an empire, they built a machine for controlling what the world knew about them. This is what the machine was hiding. John D. Rockefeller presented himself to the world as a devout Baptist who gave to his church and lived modestly, and believed that his fortune was God's reward for righteous living. The presentation was not entirely false. He did give to his church. He did live more modestly than his wealth required. He did believe, with apparent sincerity, that God had chosen him for prosperity. What the presentation omitted was the method. The South Improvement Company was a secret arrangement that Rockefeller and a small group of railroad executives created in 1872. The structure was elegant in the way that a trap is elegant. Standard Oil and a few allied refiners would guarantee the railroads massive shipping volume. In exchange, the railroads would give Standard Oil dramatically reduced rates, sometimes half of what competitors paid. But the arrangement went further than that. The railroads would also collect a surcharge from Standard Oil's competitors and pay that surcharge directly to Standard Oil. Every barrel of oil that a competing refinery shipped on a railroad was generating revenue, not just for the railroad, but for Rockefeller himself. His competitors were, without knowing it, funding the company that was destroying them. When the arrangement became public through a leak in early 1872, the reaction was immediate and violent. Oil producers in western Pennsylvania organized boycotts. Newspapers called it the monster. The Pennsylvania legislature revoked the South Improvement Company's charter within weeks. Rockefeller responded by denying everything, dissolving the formal arrangement, and then quietly rebuilding the same network of railroad agreements through less visible structures that would take investigators another decade to fully document. He had learned something important. The arrangement itself was less important than the perception of the arrangement. What mattered was not what he did, but what could be proven. The railroad agreements were sophisticated. The espionage was cruder, but no less effective. Standard Oil maintained a network of informants inside competing oil companies, inside the railroads, inside the government agencies that were supposed to be regulating the industry. These were not elaborate intelligence operations. They were simply Standard Oil employees whose job was to gather information about competitors' shipments, pricing decisions and business plans, and report that information to Standard Oil's management. When a competitor was about to close a significant deal, Standard Oil would often know about it before the deal was signed. When a competing refinery was struggling financially and might be vulnerable to acquisition, Standard Oil's buyers would appear almost before the owners had acknowledged the difficulty to themselves. One refiner in Cleveland described receiving a visit from a Standard Oil representative the morning after he had told his wife in private that the business was in trouble. He had told no one else. The Standard Oil representative offered to buy the refiner at a price that suggested prior knowledge of exactly how much trouble the business was in. Whether that particular story is precisely accurate is impossible to verify. What is documented is that Standard Oil had sources of commercial intelligence that went well beyond what normal business competition would explain, and that this intelligence was used systematically to identify and acquire vulnerable competitors before they had the opportunity to stabilize or find alternative buyers. Rockefeller never acknowledged any of this publicly. His lawyers handled the questions. His public relations operation, one of the first sophisticated corporate communications departments in American history, managed the narrative. The Ludlow massacre is the darkest entry in the Rockefeller ledger. By 1913, John D. Rockefeller Jr. was managing much of the family's non-standard oil investments, including the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, a mining operation that employed thousands of workers in southern Colorado under conditions that labor historians have described as industrial feudalism. The miners lived in company towns owned by Colorado Fuel and Iron. They bought food and goods from company stores at prices set by the company. Their children attended company schools. They were paid in company scrap that could only be redeemed at company establishments. They could be evicted from their homes if they went on strike. They were, in every practical sense, captives of the system that employed them. In September 1913, 11,000 miners went on strike. They were evicted from their company homes. They set up tent colonies on land owned by the United Mine Workers. The largest of these colonies was at Ludlow. The Colorado National Guard arrived ostensibly to keep order. In practice, the Guard functioned as an enforcement arm of the mining companies. Guardsmen harassed striking miners, searched the tent colonies for weapons, and arrested union organizers on charges that rarely survived legal scrutiny. On April 20, 1914, the Guard opened fire on the Ludlow colony with rifles and a machine gun. The attack continued through the day. That night, guardsmen moved through the colony, and in the chaos of fire and smoke, 2 women and 11 children were found asphyxiated in a pit beneath one of the tents where they had taken shelter. 20 people died at Ludlow. The event became known as the Ludlow massacre. John D. Rockefeller Jr. was in New York. He denied knowledge of the Guard's actions. He said he had not ordered the attack. He said he supported the right of workers to organize, though his company's actions throughout the strike suggested the opposite. He hired a public relations expert named Ivy Lee, considered one of the founders of the modern PR industry, to manage the aftermath. Lee produced pamphlets defending Colorado Fuel and Iron's labor practices, and distributed them to newspapers and opinion leaders. Some of the pamphlets contained information that was factually incorrect. Lee knew this and distributed them anyway. Rockefeller eventually visited the Colorado mines in 1915 and implemented modest reforms. He called it industrial democracy. Labor historians called it the most expensive public relations operation in American history. The miners called it too late. The eugenics funding is the part of the Rockefeller story that the family's official histories handle with the most delicacy. In the early 20th century, eugenics was not a fringe idea. It was academic, it was respectable, it was taught in universities and published in peer-reviewed journals, and endorsed by scientists and politicians and intellectuals across the political spectrum. The idea that human society could be improved by encouraging reproduction. Among those deemed fit and discouraging, or preventing reproduction among those deemed unfit, was in the 1910s and 1920s considered progressive. The Rockefeller Foundation funded eugenics research extensively throughout this period. The Bureau of Social Hygiene, funded by John D. Rockefeller Jr., supported research into heredity and human breeding. The Rockefeller Foundation provided grants to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Germany, which was conducting eugenics research that would later directly inform the racial policies of the Nazi regime. The foundation's grants to German eugenics research continued into the 1930s. After Hitler had come to power and the direction of German eugenics policy was unmistakable, the foundations eventually cut its German funding in 1939. By then, the infrastructure it had helped build was being used for purposes that no Rockefeller document ever explicitly endorsed, but that the research had made possible. The family's defenders make a point that is, technically, accurate. The Rockefeller Foundation did not fund the Holocaust. The eugenics research it funded was conducted by scientists who would, in many cases, have been appalled by what Germany did with the ideas. The foundation was one of many American institutions that supported eugenics research during a period when doing so was considered socially responsible. All of this is true. None of it fully resolves the question of what it means to have funded the scientific infrastructure of an ideology that killed millions. Michael Rockefeller disappeared on November 19, 1961. He was 23 years old, the son of Nelson Rockefeller, and he was in the Arafura Sea off the coast of what was then Dutch New Guinea, when the catamaran he was traveling on capsized. He tied 2 empty gasoline cans together as flotation devices and told his companion he was going to try to swim for shore. He was last seen heading toward a coast that was approximately 15 kilometers away. He was never found. The official conclusion was that he drowned. The waters were shark-infested. The currents were unpredictable. The distance was significant. These are all facts, but there is another version, documented most extensively by journalist Carl Hoffman in a 2014 book, based on interviews with elderly Asmat tribespeople who had never before spoken to outsiders about what they knew. The Asmat people of New Guinea had a tradition of ritual killing and cannibalism that Dutch colonial authorities had been attempting with limited success to suppress. In 1958, 3 years before Michael Rockefeller's disappearance, Dutch officials had killed several Asmat men in a confrontation at a village called Otranep. The killing had not been forgotten. Hoffman's research suggests, based on testimony from Asmat elders, that Michael Rockefeller did make it to shore, that he was recognized as a white man, possibly associated with the colonial authority that had killed members of their community, that he was killed in an act of ritual vengeance and consumed in a ceremony whose details the elders describe with specificity that Hoffman found impossible to dismiss. The Rockefeller family has never accepted this version. Nelson Rockefeller flew to New Guinea immediately after his son's disappearance and mounted an extensive search. He spent the rest of his life, by most accounts, believing that Michael had drowned. The Dutch colonial government had information in 1961 that suggested a different conclusion. That information was suppressed. A report was written and classified. It was not released until decades later. Whether Michael Rockefeller drowned or died differently, the fact that the government suppressed potentially relevant information about the fate of an American citizen at the request or with the cooperation of a family powerful enough to make such suppression happen is itself a story about what it means to have the kind of power the Rockefellers had. The most carefully kept secret of the Rockefeller family is not any specific crime or scandal. It is the machinery itself. John D. Rockefeller Sr. understood before almost anyone else that in the modern world, the management of information was as important as the management of money. He hired the first corporate press agents. He cultivated journalists who would write favorably about Standard Oil. He created philanthropic institutions that shaped public perception of the family, not as extractors of wealth, but as distributors of it. His son hired Ivy Lee, who essentially invented modern public relations to manage the aftermath of Ludlow. The family maintained relationships with editors and publishers that ensured certain stories were soft-pedaled and certain questions were not asked aggressively. The Rockefeller Archive Center, established by the family, controls access to much of the primary documentation of family history. Researchers who have worked with those archives describe an institution that is professionally managed and genuinely helpful in many respects, and that also makes certain categories of material difficult to access. This is not unique to the Rockefellers. Powerful families control their own archives. They fund their own historians. They shape their own narratives. What is unusual about the Rockefellers is the scale and the sophistication. A family that built a company that controlled 90% of an industry applied the same systematic thinking to the management of its reputation. The result is a public image that, more than a century after Standard Oil's breakup, remains largely positive despite a record that contains the self-improvement company Ludlow, eugenics funding, and a disappearance that has never been fully explained. John D. Rockefeller died in 1937, having given away more than $500 million, having outlived most of his critics, and having watched the Supreme Court's attempt to destroy his legacy instead multiply his fortune. He was, by any measure, one of the most consequential human beings of the 19th and 20th centuries. The institutions he built still function. The university he funded is still ranked among the best in the world. The public health campaigns he financed saved millions of lives. He was also a man who bribed railroad executives, ran a network of commercial spies, presided over a company whose labor practices ended in massacre, funded research that contributed to the ideological infrastructure of genocide, and whose family suppressed information about the death of his grandson with the quiet efficiency of people who had been managing inconvenient information for a very long time. Both of these things are true. They do not cancel each other out. They are simply the full picture of what it looks like when one human being accumulates more power than any system was designed to contain. The Rockefellers did not hide their secrets because they were uniquely evil. They hid them because they could, and the ability to hide them was itself the clearest expression of what the fortune had actually purchased. Not just oil refineries, not just universities, not just the vice presidency. The ability to decide what the story was. That was the real monopoly. Subscribe if this one changed how you see the Rockefellers. Every week, we go deeper into the dynasties that shaped history, and the ones that shaped what we know about history. The truth is always more complicated than the official version. It always is.